Welcome, everybody. We are just going to wait a few minutes for everyone to join this webinar. Very excited for you to be here. Thank you.
Yay, okay.
Dogs. Okay, we have a few more people joining. We'll be just a minute and then we'll get started. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. We are just about to get started. We have a few more people coming into the room. Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to this special training being presented by Free to Thrive on domestic violence strangulation and why it's called the last warning shot. We are a couple of housekeeping things. First, make sure that you've selected speaker view in the top right corner of your Zoom window. This will help you have the best and most optimal viewing experience. If you have any technical issues during the presentation, please reach out to our training coordinator, Elaine. Her contact information is on the screen right there. This will also be recorded. So please, if you missed something and you're worried about what you've missed, you can always go back on our website and see the recording of this presentation there. All participants are muted. We cannot see you. We cannot hear you. We encourage you to use the question and answer chat feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. I will be moderating that chat. So some questions I'll be able to answer within the chat feature itself, and some questions we will have answered live at the end of this presentation. Really excited for this presentation today. We have a couple of great domestic violence experts here in San Diego. Gail Strack is the CEO and co-founder of Alliance for Hope International. It's an organization that provides a lot of advocacy support for domestic violence victims and trains across the world, law enforcement, prosecutors, doctors, and other professionals in this space. And Michelle Shores is a forensic nurse examiner and the program director for Palomar Health and Forensic Services for San Diego. I am Nick Moore. I'm the Senior Staff Attorney and Family Justice Coordinator, Program Coordinator for Free to Thrive. And thank you so much for joining us. Just so people understand, there are a number of ways you'll be able to use this particular presentation. It has applications in criminal court, family court, civil court, as well as social work in general. When I was talking with Gail and Michelle earlier, one of the things that I mentioned was this is one of the trainings that fundamentally altered my practice of law and helped me look at domestic violence in an entirely new light. So I'm really excited that Free to Thrive has the opportunity to share that with you. That said, we are going to be talking about some very heavy subject matter. And I just want to let anyone know who has experienced domestic violence or who has had a close family member, loved one who's experienced domestic violence. Some of the things in this presentation may be triggering for you. One of the things that we like to do is just sort of ground down and focus before these types of presentations. Anytime that you feel triggered, please remember you can just draw attention to your breath, and it usually helps calm things down. So we like to start these presentations with just a moment to kind of center ourselves and take a deep breath in and focus on our breath and hold it a little bit at the top and a nice exhale. This is a pretty stressful area of work to be working in, and I find that just coming back to my breath helps me get through a lot of stressful days. With that said, I'm going to introduce you to Gail Strack, CEO and co-founder of Alliance for Hope International. She is going to tell you about why this is so important for everyone to learn within the legal system, within the medical system, and within society at large. So Gail, take it away.
Well, thank you, Nick. It's an honor to be here. Hopefully you can hear me. And we're also going to do a little switch. So I have the keys to the car, so to speak. And I want to thank Fernanda from our team who is here, and also Elaine working behind the scenes. It takes other people who are smarter than me to kind of work all this technology. Well, Nick, it's great to see you. You're looking pretty darn sharp. It's been a while since I've actually seen you live and in person when you were with us at the Justice Legal Network. But thank you for your commitment to helping vulnerable victims. And as I was preparing for this, I think it's a very important time that we are all together to talk about these issues, especially that this is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Many of our DV cases are sort of human trafficking cases as well. It's just kind of knowing what to look for. But today we're going to stay focused on strangulation. I've got a lot to cover. Nick knows this. We now have an advanced course. Michelle is here, and it's an honor to be on this panel with her. She's one of our amazing faculty members, and we're doing 5 Fridays in October for our advanced course. So we're kind of taking 5 days of information and putting it all into about a little over an hour. So I'd say buckle up for safety. We're going to be covering a lot of material. I know you guys can kind of handle this. And as Nick said, you'll get a recording, and you also will have access to our Dropbox, so you can even have more. We're kind of like the AT&T commercial. So as I try to figure out how to advance the slides, let's see if I see that. I don't know, Fernanda, there it is. Okay, here we go. What you saw just before I advance the slides is my quote. A little bit of background about me. I started my career as a public defender, handling many of these cases before I had a chance to meet Casey Gwinn. And Casey Gwinn started evidence-based prosecution in San Diego, realizing that a lot of victims recant, minimize, being threatened, fearful, not feeling comfortable to testify in court, but crimes were happening. And if you don't intervene early, homicides would occur. So I ended up meeting him in a trial. I call it mutual combat because it was hand-to-hand combat for 5 days. But after that domestic violence trial, he won, I lost. But I got to see what it was like to have passion and be very passionate about your cause. And Casey Gwinn was that person. And he stood up for people who, at that time, no one wanted to handle domestic violence cases. And we're in the same situation now. These are difficult cases, but we need people with passion to be able to handle it. So fast forward, I stopped being a defense attorney, become a prosecutor. I make my way to the domestic violence unit. Casey becomes our next elected city attorney, and I take over his specialized domestic violence unit. My goal was not to screw up, not to have anyone die under my watch. I think if you handle domestic violence cases or human trafficking cases, you know that our clients are at risk. So their safety is of utmost importance. But in 1995, that's right, the late 1900s, I'm in charge now, and I got a phone call from the police department. Essentially within 1 month, I found out that we had 2 teenagers who died as a result of domestic violence. Cassandra was stabbed to death when she was killed. She was a young mother at the time. Tamara was strangled to death, then set on fire, left on a dirt road for her mother to find her. The common denominator between these two young teenagers is they both were choked, as we used to call it, before they were killed. They both called the police to report that their ex had choked them. Neither case got prosecuted because we did not know how to investigate, document, identify, prosecute, or even understand the lethality of strangulation cases. So these two teenagers I share in every one of my presentations. They are my compass. They are my reminder as to why I do this work. I made a promise to their families never to let their daughters die in vain, and we would figure this out. So that I am here because of them. So Nick challenged me. He said, Gail, I need you to start to tell them why this is so important. And then I started to write why it was so important. And the list is really long. But the key ones is that this is very lethal. This is something where if you are strangled even one time, you're 750% more likely to be killed. And if you're lucky to survive, you've probably suffered an anoxic brain injury. So we know from a study that we ended up conducting in San Diego that this is a weapon of choice. This is about power and control, and it's about the worst kind of power and control because it's about communicating to somebody, your loved one, person who you know. In our situation in domestic violence and sexual assault, sometimes they're strangers, but mostly this is happening in intimate partner relationships. You're communicating, I can kill you. And either you submit or you die. And that has immediate, delayed, and long-term devastating consequences. So that's what we're going to be talking about, is why this is different, why it's lethal. I also decided to kind of do a little more research to see if there's any new articles on human trafficking and anything related to strangulation. And I did find this article that came out last year. I had a chance to review it, and I kind of like, it was important to read. And in fact, I'm going to share it with you so you can read it. It does emphasize the long-term health consequences, which I mentioned, but they identified victims who were strangled and who were human trafficking victims. They were only strangled 50% of the time. And that seemed, quite frankly, low to me, especially what I've learned from Nick and other professionals who handle these cases. So I thought we would do some research and benchmarking by having our first poll question. And what do you think? What percentage of trafficking victims do you think are strangled or suffocated? And by that, I'm talking about pressure being applied to a victim's neck, obstructing airflow or blood flow. Is it 50% of the time in your experience, or is it as high as 75? High as 85, high as 95%, or possibly 100%. Okay, so I'm hoping that we can take a picture of this because this is research. I'll just take a picture real quick. Oh, the low is 54%. We're much higher, okay, as what I suspected. So I'm going to send this back to the researcher. And this is why I think they got it wrong. Is if we go ahead, let me see if I can take that off. Perfect. We'll stop sharing that and keep going. I think we just, did we share the results? Or am I stuck in this little circle? Here's a couple of observations. When I looked at their report, let's see, what's happening? Let's back up a little bit, please. There we go. And then I'll try to take the keys back to the car. If not, Nick, you'll advance for me. So I looked at the questionnaire and tried to figure out, how did they ask this question? Well, they asked the question, were you strangled? And most of the time, victims are going to use choking. Victims rarely use strangulation. Strangulation means different things to different people. Choking means different things to different people. So over time, we have learned the best thing to ask, has any pressure been applied on or around your neck by any means? And as I've been talking to my colleagues like Ruth Downey, who's a forensic nurse, she too said, every time I talk to a survivor, a trafficking survivor who's been choked out, in her words, they say it's happening more frequently than they can even count. So I do think it's much more prevalent than 54%, and they're dealing with absolutely some devastating health issues. Let's go to the next slide. So what I want to share is kind of a parallel learning. What we learned back in 1995 when there was no research available about DV victims who were strangled. Because there was no research, we did our own study of 300 cases. If you go to the next slide, I'll share some key points and also similarities. One was that there was a county-wide, city-wide minimization by victims because they didn't understand this. Dispatchers, police officers, investigators, paramedics, prosecutors, defense attorneys, all of us, we just didn't get it because we didn't receive training. We didn't have protocols in place. We didn't even have a law in place that called out strangulation. If you go to the next slide, I'm not going to go play this video 911 tape, but what the 911 tapes really showed us was that minimization. And in this particular one, the victim is really having difficulty breathing. And the dispatcher is saying, do you need a paramedic? And she's saying, no, but I can't breathe. And they go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So what that 911 call made me realize is that if we are going to build a response, whether it's child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking, we need to have all the key players on the same page and everyone being trained so they know the right questions to ask, because there can be a victim right in front of us in plain sight and we need to look for all of the clues. So the next slide, we had to learn about strangulation. Why did most of these victims have no visible injuries? Why did we miss it? And what we discovered is that manual strangulation was the most common, and that they were strangled repeatedly. Ligature cases were rare, but if you do have a ligature case, I am totally convinced that that is an attempted homicide, because there's no other reason you would put a ligature around someone's neck unless you intend to kill them. Our team right now in our justice project is working on a case that we believe is a human trafficking case where he made it look like a suicide, but he ended up killing her. So we're now starting our investigation to try to find justice for Libby, because he was trying to prostitute her. She didn't want to, and he was taking control of the situation. So let's go to the next slide. A couple of things we learned: most victims have no visible injury, and most victims do not seek medical attention. As I compared the human trafficking article with our knowledge of strangulation, this is a place where the researchers believe is a good intervention point for the medical professionals, given the amount of physical violence that a lot of the victims go through, that when they seek medical attention, it is going to be critical for the medical professionals to know what questions to ask to try to identify a survivor and try to intervene. But generally, most victims will not seek medical attention for a number of reasons, and also their abusers will keep them from seeking medical attention. Next slide. Signs and symptoms. So what do you look for to try to figure out if your victim was strangled or your client, but she may not tell you? And there's a lot of reasons why victims may not tell you about strangulation. One, they don't think it's a big deal because they've had so much violence and this seems minor compared to other things. Two, they may be so traumatized that they don't remember. A lack of oxygen to the brain can't keep memories from forming. You're going to learn about the hippocampus from Michelle Shores. And when the hippocampus is not working, it's not recording. So it may seem like you may be dealing with an uncooperative victim, but in reality, what you are seeing is evidence of trauma and evidence of loss of consciousness. But victims who are strangled can be strangled to the point of loss of consciousness, where they urinate, where they defecate, where they have miscarriages, where they have internal injuries, they lose their voice. They can also have fractures, and without imaging, we could miss it. Next slide. I want to introduce you to Dr. Dean Hawley, who is a pathologist. He's currently retired, but he was my first instructor and he taught me so much. It's interesting. We learned everything we know about non-fatal strangulation from a pathologist who dedicated his career to handling cases and figuring out the cause of death. He told me two important things. He said, one, Gail, you need to know that you can strangle someone to death. and not leave a single external mark. That when it comes to strangulation, even pathologists will have a hard time figuring out the cause of death, but it's internal, and the best way to figure that out is an autopsy. So that led us to believe that we got a long journey ahead, because we've also have to convince hospitals to take strangulation, or medical professionals to take this seriously and to do imaging. Let's go to the next slide. So a little bit more about our San Diego study. Eventually, it ended up being published. You go to the next slide, in the Journal of Emergency Medicine. 6 articles were published in that special edition. Since then, we now have a bibliography, and we keep track of all of the strangulation cases. We are way over 400 cases, and they all essentially say the same thing. We're finding out more detail about it. But what we want to share is some of those findings. There's a little something for everybody, from our understanding to talking to survivors. What are some of the legal issues? What does the clinical examination look like? What can we learn from fatal strangulations? And what happens if victims are strangled repeatedly, which is going to be most likely your client. So let's go to the next page. I want to highlight a few things. Dr. Wilbur was the lead author, where we interviewed a number of survivors, and we wanted to figure out what was their experience. What did they think was going to happen? And 87% of them said they were threatened with death, and they thought that they were going to die. There was a history of domestic violence that was getting worse, much like all of the training that all of us received in domestic violence, that you have to intervene early. Otherwise, you're just headed toward a homicide. Let's go to the next slide. The other key finding was the need to do follow up, and that you can have some serious health consequences, and we need to be following up within 24, 48, 72 hours. So let's go to the next slide. So this is probably the time maybe a victim may call the police or seek a protection order, call an attorney. So in many ways, you might be that first responder. So I also wanted to help you to put this into context and understand that stranglers are different. Going to the next slide, I'm assuming everybody has probably been trained in the continuum of violence. I'm going to make my first confession. I thought strangulation was no big deal because there was no visible injuries. And I put it right by a slap, where in the cases where there was just a slap or a punch, there was minor injury. Little did I know that you cannot assess a strangulation case by a lack of visible injuries or visible injuries. Strangulation is the last warning shot before someone is killed. In the United States today, we are seeing an increase of domestic violence homicides at a minimum 20%. By the time we get through COVID, it's probably going to be much higher, because we're seeing the worst domestic violence homicides, not just homicides, but DV, an increase of DV homicides, an increase of suicides, and an increase of murder suicides. So when we finally get the final statistics, it's going to be shocking and stunning, but probably no surprise to all of you on this call. So think of strangulation as your last opportunity to intervene before something bad happens. Let's go to the next slide. Power and control. Now this is a check mark. I'm hoping that all of you have been trained in the power and control, because this is how we're going to kind of distinguish what type of offender that we're dealing with. Most of our victims have experienced everything on that power and control wheel. But to put it in a different perspective, I challenge you to take that power and control wheel, go to the next slide, and turn it into penal code sections. Your clients, victims, are experiencing numerous crimes as a result of the relationship and their environment that they're in. And strangulation is coercive control. New research is coming out about that, and is essentially the ultimate form of control. As I said before, it communicates submit or die. And stranglers have been described to have the God complex, because they know they can control someone's last breath. And victims have reported completely giving up. And so they will not even do some help-seeking behaviors like calling the police, seeking medical attention, because they are paralyzed with fear. Go to the next slide. So the research is also clear that strangulation is very terrifying. It's now considered the equivalent of torture, the equivalent of waterboarding, and internationally, waterboarding has been banned as any kind of form of torture in any kind of human rights kind of situation. But this is very telling. And as we were talking before, we were talking about some cases where prosecutors are now prosecuting strangulation as torture, because what you're doing is you're causing trauma to the brain. And when trauma occurs over and over and over again, the brain actually will shrink. Let's go to the next slide. This is a client of the San Diego Family Justice Center, a survivor, a member of our Voices Committee, who helped me understand this godlike complex. And I hear this repeatedly from victims after that they were strangled. They are more terrified, more fearful, and they just give all their power. They stop trying to stand up for themselves. Let's go to the next slide. And we're going to wrap this up in the next couple of minutes. I would encourage you to take a look at the Strangulation Chronicles. This was done by some therapists working with batterers. After attending one of our classes, they wanted to understand, who are these stranglers? So they did a lot of research with men who had been convicted of strangulation, and it really highlights what they're thinking. If you go to the next slide, well, I highlighted a couple. We'll go to number 3 because I think it's more relevant to yours situation. No better way to get her full attention, especially when she realizes it could end her life in a snap. And it also talks about that God-like complex of being in control and how addictive it is. The other slide that I want to show you as we wrap up this piece is understanding trauma and understanding lethality. So if you're interested in this research, if you go to the next slide, you will see the article, Non-Fatal Strangulation is an Important Risk Factor for Homicide of Women. So what we know in general is that most women in the United States are actually killed by a gun, but before they are killed, they are strangled. Depending on which study you read, strangulation is one of the highest predictors of a homicide, from either 50% of the time they were strangled before they were killed up to 100% of the time, which is why we call it the last warning shot. So one more point, and then I'm back to Nick. If you go to the next slide, keep going one more. I want to just share about who are these stranglers, and what we know about them is that they're also connected to police incidents, shooting police officers. Go to the next slide. They've also been involved in mass shootings. So we've been analyzing this and tracking it. We track mass shooters. We track police officers who are shot in the line of duty. We try to figure out in public records requests, who were they? And we see a history of domestic violence at least by 80%. And what we're able to track in public records, strangulation, at least 50% of the time. So they're different. I call strangulation the calling card of a killer. Not every strangler will kill, but it's going to be hard to find a killer who hasn't strangled. Next slide. And I think that should bring us to the, oh, I got a couple of more. How did I sneak in a couple of more? Outstanding. So what is the law? Real quickly, since 1995, if you go to the next slide, we have now had the chance of passing strangulation laws in 48 different states. Tribes are including it. The federal code and the military code now includes strangulation and suffocation. Most of these are felonies, and then the federal law recommends up to 10 years. Just for you to kind of get a sense of where we are nationally and how they're treating this as far as the type of crime that they committed. Let's go to the next slide. In California, we have the duty to warn. And this is important because if police respond to DV calls in California, they have a duty to warn victims, especially if they find out they were strangled, that strangulation is serious, can cause internal injuries, and they should seek immediate medical attention. Our law also is duty to track, where we're tracking stranglers So this way we can enhance victim safety, officer safety as well. Next slide. And I think this is the last one. This really summarizes my key points here. This is a law from Canada, but we have similar laws, but this one just said it so perfectly. Rendering someone unconscious, whether by choking, strangulation, or suffocation, is inherently dangerous, easily capable of causing brain death, and devastating long-term consequences. And the difference between life or death is literally only a matter of seconds. And in the final analysis, this is an act of cruel domination met by sheer horror and often accompanied by physical and long-term psychological harm. So thank you. I think that wraps up this first piece, and now to medical.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Gail. While I get my screen up here, I want to say thank you, everybody, for having me on the panel today. My name is Michelle Shores, and I will echo what Gail said. I have a great privilege to work with these patients in San Diego County and also Riverside County, and just learning from Gail. She was the first one who I went to a presentation and opened my eyes about strangulation, and then having the privilege to work with Free to Thrive. So that being said, my name is Michelle Shores. I am the director for the Forensic Health Program in San Diego County. And I also work as a forensic nurse in Riverside County, because nurses can never have enough jobs. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the medical perspective and how have we incorporated education in our county for strangulation specifically. So a little background on San Diego County. You know, we had the first Family Justice Center. We had the study that Gail talked about with her, the 300 patients, and really kind of recognizing it. And in 2017, as Gail discussed with that Roth law, law enforcement had a duty to warn patients that when they went to a scene, that they've been strangled, that they need to seek medical care. But the gap in that was not all that medical didn't necessarily understand the danger. And so we're going to talk a little bit about where we were and where we've come. But we first have to, I think, come from the perspective of education and understanding what is normal. So when I'm evaluating a patient, doing educations or educating the court, it's really important. I think we take breathing for granted. We take, how does our brain get oxygen for granted? And so we just want to walk you through the basics here. In order for our body to have life-sustaining oxygenation, we have to have the free flow of oxygen from our nose or our mouth that goes down the trachea, goes into the lungs. Our lungs then exchange that oxygen into our bloodstream. That oxygen-rich blood will then go through our heart and will go through the arterial system or the artery system to help oxygenize the various organs and parts of our body that need oxygen. So your artery is your high pressure highway system for oxygenation. So the way our brain gets oxygen is through the carotid artery. So A for up. So we have about 80% of our oxygen-rich blood goes up those carotid arteries in the front, and about 18 to 20% go through the vertebral arteries in the back. So if you're a visual person, which I am, it's a journey, right? So through the lungs, through the heart, up. The brain then uses that oxygen-rich blood at the cellular level, and then exchanges the carbon dioxide rich blood. Then it comes back down the jugular vein, or V, back through the heart, back through the lungs, and then back, which is exhaled out. So as Nick was talking to you about centering and your breath, think about that. So that is a step-by-step motion to getting oxygen-rich blood to our body, and specifically our brain. Our brain cannot get oxygen any other way. So taking you through some of the normal structures as we talk about strangulation and the definition of strangulation. So again, you have your carotid arteries, you have your jugular veins, you have your hyoid bone, your trachea, those are thyroid cartilage, tracheal rings. So again, you have to have that free flow of oxygen to come down that trachea, but you also have to have the free flow blood to go up to your brain or come back down. And this is a tool that I like to use when I am educating the court. So Gail touched on this earlier, but what is strangulation? And so medically, so strangulation is a form of asphyxia or lack of oxygen or no oxygen that is characterized by the closure of blood flow and or airflow. So oftentimes you'll hear, you know, people say that they were screaming and then they lost consciousness. And it depends on how and where the pressure has been applied on the neck. So if there is no tracheal involvement, you might be able to still take in oxygen. However, you're blocking those vessels for the brain to be able to get oxygen-rich blood. So it is the external pressure of the neck that it occludes blood flow and or airflow that results in asphyxia, anoxia, hypoxia. So you're decreasing the body's normal ability to get to function and provide oxygenation. Now, I know Gail talks about this, but you know, patients really do identify with choking. And I was choked out. Yeah, they choked me out. Like, yeah, we choke out. You know, that's how we typically hear it. Very rarely in my career have I heard a patient say, no, I was strangled. So as a medical provider, we understand, and I think in all of our practice, we understand that is the common nomenclature that is used to identify that external pressure. But the actual mechanism of injury is strangulation with that external pressure to the neck. And then mechanical asphyxia is if somebody is sitting on your chest, it really restricts that bellows motion, so your body's ability to be able to breathe. Different types of strangulation. You have your manual strangulation, ligature strangulation, hanging, which can be complete or non-complete. And, you know, maybe Gail will touch on this a little bit, but my understanding is there is really fatal or non-fatal strangulation. And I think attempted strangulation was used in older literature to describe what we know now as fatal versus non-fatal, because for me as a medical provider, if there's external pressure to the neck that's occluding that blood flow and or airflow, it is strangulation as a mechanism. So just a little visual, you know, again, thinking of the mechanism or how does this happen? So you choke on a carrot. So choking is a foreign body that is lodged in your airway. And that's resulting in that asphyxia or anoxia. But strangulation is not that. So this is I think a visual of this is what choking is versus strangulation. And I think there's gonna be a link to a video that you can watch on EA Sports that shows, it's a YouTube video that shows what happens during a strangulation and what happens to the body. So putting it in perspective, when I am educating my patients or the court, and a normal handshake is about 60 to 80 PSI on average. To open a can of Coke is about 20 PSI. To occlude the vessels in your neck, the carotid arteries is around 11 PSI, and the jugular vein is only about 4 PSI. So you can see it does not take much pressure to actually occlude those blood vessels with external pressure that's applied to the neck, putting it in perspective. And then the other thing is what happens? What is happening to our body? So as a result of the body's normal response to trauma, or which is an external, usually an external event that has caused an internal response. Our amygdala is our fear center, and that senses as part of the limbic system. It senses fear or a danger, and that part of the brain, as that is enacted, the part of the brain that is above that is the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is your file storage. It's basically your memory file system, and in the case of trauma, fear, or lack of oxygen to the brain, our memory systems become jumbled. And, the patient may never get back a linear memory. And to us, that is indicative that there has been a loss of oxygen or trauma. And when your hippocampus is it stops filing memories, it actually will signal your HPA axis, which your body will start pumping cortisol. So it's trying to have that fight, flight, or freeze response. And that is a very innate response. So sometimes patients have that shame or guilt that they couldn't move, they couldn't fight back. Or on the opposite scale, where you'll see patients that have had strangulation that maybe come out of it, and you have to think of this as well, like, and I've seen this in ER and trauma, and sometimes patients come out of an event and they are fighting. So they might seem like they're the primary aggressor. They might seem like they are, and it's ultimately they are fighting for they're fighting for their life. So what happens long term? Not only can you, so you can lose consciousness very, very fast, but, with strangulation, if you do not have oxygen rich blood to your brain, your synapses and your synapses and neurons begin dying by the millions, and they don't come back. So you'll see patients that have that amnesia. Sometimes they'll get depressed, they'll have like dementia symptoms, but ultimately that is a key indicator that if that patient is having trouble with their memory, that very well could have been a anoxic brain injury. What are some other signs and symptoms? Great information on the Strangulation Institute. You're going to have this, but truthfully, a lot of our patients have more symptoms. So when we are talking to them, we're asking them questions about sore throat, how are they feeling? So those signs or those symptoms, hoarse voice, loss of vision, ringing in their ears, headache, nausea. Maybe the last thing they remember was there was hands or on their neck on the couch, and then they woke up in the kitchen. So not every patient knows they lost consciousness, but they could have parts of their memory that are missing, which is indicative of a loss of consciousness. We have, once that pressure is applied to the neck, with continued pressure, you can lose consciousness within 6 to 9 seconds. With continued pressure, you can lose bladder within 15 seconds, bowel within 30, and you could potentially have death within 90 seconds to 2 minutes. So it is something that can happen very rapidly. So if a patient maybe tells us that they had changed their clothing, we might ask, can you tell me why? And it's very embarrassing to admit that you've peed or pooped on yourself. But for us, on the medical perspective, that is a clinical indicator that they had pressure applied continuously to their neck for a minimum of 15 seconds. So that is your brain's, your body's essentially shutting down. It's losing its ability to do normal function. I think society and media, and probably you can relate in working in the trafficking realm, is we expect to have these large injuries and see all of this injury, and truth, we don't. Half of the patients we see have no external visible findings, and so it's really keying in on those feelings and those symptoms that they had that are clinical indicators of anoxia to the brain. There's a link on YouTube. Dr. Bill Smock and the Strangulation Institute talk about a case study of a nurse who 6 days after a strangulation assault was diagnosed with bilateral carotid dissections. So why is bilateral carotid dissections a big deal? So earlier, as I discussed your heart and the normal physiology, think of it this way. You have your pump and your pipes. Your heart is your pump. Those vessels in your neck are your pipes. With that external pressure to the neck, as those pipes or your carotid arteries and veins are compressed, your heart is still attempting to pump that oxygen-rich blood to your brain. And like a garden hose, if you kink it, or you're squeezing out those pipes, what happens is that pressure builds up as that high pressure system is trying to get that oxygen to your brain. And you can have a carotid dissection. And what that is inside the intima or the lining of the vessels, as that pressure is building up behind it, it can tear. And as it tears, the body has an innate and wants to heal itself. So with that tear or like a bleeding inside those vessels, the body begins to repair itself, and it does that by making clots. So it sends in those white blood cells. Everything begins to start to try to heal. But what can happen is later on that clot can dislodge, and it goes north, and you can actually have a stroke. So this is why we really encourage patients to go and get that CAT scan, get a CTA of the neck, because even with no external visible findings, they could have significant internal findings that might be life-threatening or debilitating even a year later. So there's a lot of literature for that, and Dr. Smock does talk about it in that YouTube video, but if you look at the literature, cryptogenic or strokes without cause in patients in the age of under 45 should really, this should be part of a neuro assessment. Has anything come across your neck? Because it very well could be from strangulation. The other thing is, looking at the whole spectrum of the family and how can we break the cycle of violence. So I'm going to tell you just real fast about some of the programs we have in San Diego, but looking at patients that are not only the patient, but the family, and identifying children in the home as secondary victims. Our program, through our domestic assault forensic exam program, we identify children in the home. They they come in for a forensic interview, and then we get them connected to short-term therapy services through our Child Advocacy Center. So what is a domestic assault forensic exam? As you heard earlier with Gail, law enforcement had that duty to warn. Kind of at the same time, San Diego developed a law enforcement protocol for law enforcement to identify strangulation. And at that same time, we had a high-risk domestic violence team, and we had a longstanding sexual assault program, and a very survivor-driven. A patient said, or she wasn't my patient, she was a survivor at this high-risk domestic violence team meeting, said, "That's great, everyone. You can change my locks. You can help me with restraining orders, but I have no evidence. I can't take pictures with my phone. He monitors my phone. I can't go to the doctor. Either he doesn't let me go until the bruises are gone, or the doctor doesn't do anything." And so that moment, it was, well, why are we having unequal access to care? Why are we not providing intimate partner and other than sexual assault patients, the ability to have a forensic medical exam with a specially trained provider? And it came down to funding, but luckily we had all the stars aligned, and we were able to get this program going. We work with, it's a multidisciplinary team approach. Everyone has their role. We work with victim advocates, mental health, law enforcement, child welfare, mental health providers, and we are the forensic medical providers in this team. There's standard documentation that we use for these exams. The state is has a 502 form. We also have a standard strangulation form. And as we're going through these open-ended questions with patients, you know, it can be very impactful when we do ask, you know, can you tell me what you were thinking? Because sometimes the patient, it's a recognition that a lot of patients believe they were going to die. And when somebody says, you know, my last thought before I went out was, will my daughter ever find me, and where will he bury my body? That is really impactful. But from a healthcare perspective, we understand this person truly believed they were going to die, and we need to get them into resources. So we go through head to toe exam. The process is about 2 to 3 hours. We work with advocacy. We provide showers, resources. If there's a sexual assault component, we do all in-house medication. Our patients receive a bill for no bill for anything that we do in our department. We'll collect forensic evidence based on history, neck swabs, fingernail scrapings, bites, if someone's been spit on, clothing collection. We do injury identification. So as a forensic examiner, we look at injuries and work backwards to the mechanism. So, you know, somebody cuts themselves with a knife, that is a shear force, versus if somebody is punched, that is a laceration, which is from blunt force. So we're looking at the injuries for blunt force trauma, strangulation, bites, and burns. Just a thing, I don't know that you'll ever get a forensic expert to testify to the age of bruises. So I just want to put this out there. There is no scientific evidence that says bruises are fresh. So everyone bruises differently. The only color that is about equal is yellow, is about 18 hours old. And so we do standard forensic photography. We take standard set of the neck every single time, ears, eyes. We do neck measurements in the same place every time. And, you know, we'll see patients that start out with a neck measurement of 32 centimeters, go up to 33 centimeters, and then go back down to 31. So it's like, think of it as that external trauma. You do have swelling. So it's like if you fell and hit your knee, you would swell, you know, so kind of linking that same concept. We look at the eyes in all the positions. We look at all the frenulums. We look at the mouth, where we do a really detailed assessment. We look at the hands. We're looking for broken fingernails. And we just document everything. And we ask the patient to show us if they are comfortable. We ask permission if they would show us how the strangulation was done. And for us, we are medical providers. We are not investigators. The reason we ask is because we need to understand the mechanism and to link that to the history and the patient's symptoms. So you can see if there was pressure applied to the trachea, we might be very concerned about fractured larynx, thyroid storm, you know, versus the forearm and bicep. You know, we're going to be concerned for the anoxic brain injury and carotid dissection. So this is a medical tool that we can use. We also, we utilize the Campbell Assessment 5 because we're asking a lot of questions, but they will go through the full danger assessment with their advocate on a different day. And linking back to that survivor story, you know, we have had an increase in felony filings in our county just by adding the forensic nurse. And that documentation, it allows the court to be educated. So, you know, almost a fourfold increase in cases being able to be filed as felonies. And one last point I'll say here is, it was great to have the forensic nurse program, but when we sent the patient to the emergency department to be evaluated and get that CTA, not all providers were educated, and sometimes they would send that patient home. So the last piece we did is, from a medical perspective, was we came up with the CARES initiative. So all the health systems in San Diego County have been taught how to assess for strangulation and do the scanning and all of the tools. You can find more information on the San Diego healthcares.org. And I'm going to pass this back to Gail.
Wow, good job, Michelle. I just love when I hear you talk about the program in San Diego. San Diego is definitely leading the way. There's only really 2 jurisdictions in America that have issued kind of like almost like a medical alert on strangulation, and that is the state of New York and the county of San Diego. So people are really following the lead of what's happening here. And it's just really fun to be back with friends. I don't know about you, but this COVID kind of makes you feel isolated. And when you feel isolated, I start to feel guilty because I can only imagine what victims and survivors are going through right now. But if all I get to see is my friends on Zoom, then I'll take whatever I can get. So fun seeing, I didn't get to see Jamie today, but I think she's in there, Nick and Michelle. So how do you build a strong case? And as Nick mentioned earlier, you can apply this information to everything you do. As I mentioned, you may be that first responder and you've got to build your case, whether I was a defense attorney, a prosecutor, or a civil attorney. And what I'm doing now, you are at some point building the case, rebuilding the case, or looking for more evidence. So a couple of resources I want to give you. Let's go to the next slide. First and foremost, I want to tell you, we just updated the statewide manual on the investigation and prosecution of strangulation cases. So that could be a really important tool. I'm going to highlight a couple of chapters. Number 1 is really good overview. It's short. You can get a lot of your talking points right from that. Chapter 2, I spent a lot of time going into the strangulation law, not only in California, but across the United States, because we now have 48 states, Maryland being our last one, that expanded sexual assault to include DV as well. Investigations is probably one of the beefy ones, except for medical. Medical, number 1, Dr. Green got carried away. He got 80 pages of medical. So I'd say that would be a good chapter to read on non-fatal strangulation. And I agree with Michelle. We are now calling it non-fatal or fatal strangulation. That was a consensus by all of our medical and legal experts. It's not attempted strangulation. We used to call it that because we thought that they were alive. So therefore it's attempted. But the minute you apply pressure, you have essentially completed the act. 2 states, one in New York says all you need is 2 seconds. The state in an appellate court decision said they're not going to put a durational requirement to this because generally the laws require obstruction of blood flow and or airflow. And that essentially can happen almost instantaneously as you are applying pressure to those vital neck structures. Okay, the next slide. I just want to emphasize trauma. This is my do-over. I wish I would have had a trauma class before I started interviewing victims, because your approach to this is critical. You're either going to get a victim who can open up and share more information, or you're going to cause somebody to shut down given the way you approach this case. So Michelle did a great job explaining what happens to the brain when it's undergoing trauma, and that amygdala, that little alarm system, goes off and it causes the brain to kind of do all kinds of crazy things. So in my experience, it is the rare case where you see a victim who can tell you absolutely everything from start to finish in chronological order. I used to think if we were dealing with a jumbled memory, ooh, that was going to be a bad case. But little did I realize that you can use that information as evidence of trauma and corroboration that they just experienced a traumatic event. Going to the next slide. This is the technical definition of trauma, but I'm also going to use this slide to tell you that I was able to identify, thanks to one of our attendees at our advanced course, because we share information with each other, which is like so cool, is that there's a great video called Trauma in the Brain, 8 minutes. I'm begging you, if you haven't had a class on trauma, at least watch the 8-minute video. Nick will give you a link to that, and or it is in our Dropbox. It's heavily, strongly recommended. It will help you explain how you can approach these interviews. Going to the next slide. I mean, the class on trauma can be a week-long course. Just kind of highlighting something here with respect to the hippocampus and trauma is that it's hard for victims to record this information. That information is in the brain somewhere, but it's all scattered. It's no wonder why we all say it's all jumbled. And I remember interviewing a cooperative victim once, and it was so rare because most victims are uncooperative in our DV caseload back then. And we were getting ready for court, trying to get everything all squared away. And all of a sudden I saw her like I disappear. And I said, do you need a break? And she said, yes. And then I told her where to go. And I said, okay, why don't you come back in 15 minutes? I never saw her again. The way I approached it, I triggered her, caused her to completely shut down and be re-traumatized to the point that she didn't want anything to do with me. And here I was, well-intentioned, and wasn't trained to spot the signs, nor how to really interview a traumatized victim, a client of yours. They're different. And Nick will tell you, because Nick was helping us with all of our DV cases with low bono, pro bono. And that's why I still like the guy. Jamie came around though and stole him away from the Justice Legal Network. Jamie, I still love you, but you did. He told me you stole his heart away and wanted to go help you with human trafficking, which I'm glad he did. You guys are doing great. So let's go to the next slide. So this is the way I was trained. Start the beginning, go to the end, put it in a chronological order, and all I want is the facts, ma'am. But it is a different type of interview altogether. And I'm going to highlight a couple of key points and then know that you either had this training or will continue to learn. Go to the next slide. So at the heart of it, it's really engaging someone's emotion and feeling. Different parts of the brain will kind of, there's like keys that you can unlock different parts of the brain where that piece of information is kind of lodged because it wasn't filed properly. So if you seem interested, and Kesey always says that, you know, you can either fake it or feel it, but either way, this approach has been very successful. You try to connect on a certain level. You sound interested, you're concerned, empathetic, and judgmental. I have a little short way of remembering this, which goes back to like the FLETC kind of model. If you go to the next slide, I call it just being nice. Be really, really nice to your clients. I mean, go out of your way to be nice, because what I've learned being the director of the San Diego Family Justice Center for 5 years, where we started with 87 clients per month. And then when I left 5 years later, we were having 1,200 clients per month. I learned a lot about working with traumatized victims, and nice goes a long way. It'll keep them coming back to you as they're making and traveling and navigating their crazy world. But let's go to the next slide, because I think when they start having trouble, another real easy tip is just give them permission that it's okay. Don't worry about it. Just tell me what you remember. We will work through this together. Because you gotta put this in perspective. When police officers are involved in a critical incident, guess what they get? They get 3 sleep cycles before they get fully interviewed about what happened in a shooting or any kind of incident. 3 sleep cycles. Why? Because even police officers who are trained to deal with trauma can be traumatized, and their memories of this information get scattered as well. And it just needs time for the brain to kind of heal and file things back where they're supposed to be. So give permission that it is okay, and let them start wherever. And I would say, don't interrupt. Let them keep talking. And if you've worked with traumatized victims, which I know you have, you just need to give yourself more time to work with them and interview them and get the information that you need in order to help them. Let's go to the next slide. And now the key. So what I've learned in all of this is start by asking very simple questions. What did you see? What did you remember? What did you feel? What did you think was going to happen? What did you smell? These things are all connected to different parts of the brain, which is holding a piece of information. And I call these the keys to uncovering all the facts. So that's my way of interpreting how we can do trauma-informed interviewing. So now what I want to do very quickly is go through 20 important questions to ask. We've got many more in the investigation chapters, but I wanted to give you the top 20 so you can kind of think about this, and I'll go through quickly. So are you ready, Nick? First question is going to be, did anyone place any pressure on or around your neck by any means? It was Detective Nick, and that wasn't Nick, it was Craig Varnum from North Carolina who gave us that tip. many years ago, and San Diego is now using that as a core question. Number two, we want to ask the question, once you find out if pressure was applied, then what type of method and how many times was pressure applied? That's going to help you figure out the intent and probably disclose where there might be some type of injury. You go to question number, well, let's go through all the different methods real quickly. One hand, two hands. You can come from the front, you can come from behind, you can do it at the same time. You can block off all blood flow forearm. If that happens, I'm thinking of sexual assault. If you look at the neck restraint, you might see some injuries towards the back, but generally those choke hold methods will not have a visible injury either at the time or after. Ligature, you will get some type of ligature case. And I would think in your situation, like we're seeing in DV cases, some of our clients or victims are being strangled to death and then they make it look like a suicide. So again, I want to emphasize, treat every suicide like a homicide. Now, victims, I'd say if you don't have a Michelle Shores, and you may be the first one to examine your client. And I remember a case where we were doing that at our office with Nick and our advocate, is you got to look right away as quickly as you can from head to toe, because we're going to be looking for certain injuries if they're there related to certain types of method. So going to the next one, the other thing that you can do is help the victim see things that she may miss because she is traumatized. So we're going to ask her to look in the mirror to see if anything is different, like that swelling of the neck that Michelle mentioned, because it could be swelling or it could be shrinking. Either way, that's going to show evidence of your internal injury, which can be documented. And of course, we're thinking about medical treatment first. So do we need to call the paramedics or get your client to the hospital before you even complete your interview? Because she is right now in a kind of medical emergency situation. And that has happened at the Family Justice Center, where we had to call the paramedics a number of times. Going to the next slide, trauma. One of the things I learned about trauma is got to be careful about some of the questions you ask, because it's hard to tell distance and time. So, but we still need to ask about how long was pressure applied in the next question, and on a scale from 1 to 10, how much pressure was applied. So Mike Agnew, a very experienced interviewer that was part of our faculty and still is, he says when it comes to time, he will generally say, let me be the clock. Close your eyes if you feel comfortable with that. Tell me when to start, tell me when to stop. But I would definitely ask that question that way. And number 6, about how much pressure was applied. That could also lead backwards to internal injury and the pounds per square inch. So intent. Can you tell me how long pressure was applied? Looks like I doubled that. Go to the next slide. Are you or were you in pain? Borrowed this from our medical nurses where they asked this question. So we've incorporated it too. And you can use those happy smiles or a really sad smile. I like number 8 too. We're still learning on this one. I think Michelle would agree. And so if you have any good questions, just let us know. Nice thing about training is I always learn something new. And so we have now recently incorporated the scale from 0 to 10, 0 meaning normal and 10 being unable to breathe. Because here's the problem. A lot of police officers who are not trained in strangulation will basically say, were you able to breathe? Yes or no? And she says, yes, because I'm alive. Then they kind of like almost discount the strangulation completely. But no, you gotta wait. Now, so was there any difficulty breathing? Were you able to take a full breath? Sometimes victims can still talk, but not yell completely. So we're going to be looking for discomfort, difficulty, anything that we can use, but do not ask just one question and move on. So this one is a difficult one, but remember, I think there's a myth that a lot of people think strangulation is mostly about airflow. I'm of the opinion, I don't know about you, Michelle, that most of these cases are probably about blood flow and also airflow. So let's go to the next slide. Any jewelry, that's going to help with corroboration and pattern injury, something that Michelle might look for. at and during her exam. So was she wearing a necklace? Was that necklace ripped off of her neck? Jewelry? Is it somewhere else? Do you see her with one earring and not the other? Little things that you may miss but can be helpful. You never know what someone is going to rely on. Let's go to number 10. This was our attempt to incorporate those trauma-informed questions, and I was just stunned at some of the responses. When we asked, what did you see? Most of our victims actually told us that the most common method was two hands in front of the victim so they could see their eyes, and they would respond with, I saw the devil, I saw darkness, I saw pure evil, I thought I was going to die. And that just still gives me the chills just thinking about and seeing them when they answered that question. Let's go to number 11. And number 11 has to do with pressure. How did you feel? So we used to ask the question, did you pass out? Silly question now, because most of them are not going to remember, but what do you remember? What did you feel when pressure was being applied during or after? And you can see these amazing responses that you can't make this stuff up unless you experienced it yourself. So let's go to the next question. Oh, actually, I wanted to highlight something. It was my misunderstanding about loss of consciousness, which I used to think it was like a light switch. It was either on or off. You were conscious or you were not. A lot of studies, including this Rosen study from 1942, where people in jail actually volunteered to be strangled collectively for 500 times. Can't do that today. It'd be against the law. But what we discovered in these studies, it's more like a dimmer switch. Every second does count, that the body is, then the brain is deprived of blood. The body needs blood and it needs to circulate exactly the way Michelle described it. Let's go to the next slide. And now we're going to go to the crime scene, because you still need to do this yourself or it needs to be done by the police. Where did it happen is one of my favorite questions, because it leads you to the crime scene and corroboration as to what she said. So this one was my case. She was strangled, no visible injuries, but we had the corroboration where he held her against the wall, banged her head against the wall, lifted her up off the floor on her toes. And there we were able to substantiate what she said. Little things, face hits, gets you to you're beyond a reasonable doubt. Or in a civil case, it's going to be less. Let's go to the next slide. Where did it happen? This is urine on the bed. So really looking for evidence of urine or defecation. Going to the next slide. As Michelle said, we're now looking for the urine. We're asking about changing of the clothes. Where are the clothes, and even discarded clothes? Going to the next one. Discarded clothes, I didn't know this, just like semen glows with lighting, urine can glow with ALS, or ultraviolet lighting. So let's go to the next slide. And now we want to know, what did he say before, during, and after? Is going to get you your intent and what most victims thought that they were going to die because they said so. Next one, 15, is asking about those text messages. Oh my God. I don't think anybody calls each other anymore. I mean, even my kids text me, and I decided I wasn't going to text back. But then I realized I got to give up on that. And whatever means of communication works, I'm going to do it. But now we're doing FaceTime and Zoom, so it's all working itself out. But this is evidence of choking. And you can see, maybe you can see it, I'll just read it to you. Yo, I'm sorry for choking you. I know that don't mean shit, and I don't want you to come back. But I do want you to know that I do regret this morning. So we were able to get this text message at the time the victim was getting her restraining order, when we ran the restraining order clinic at the Family Justice Center, and able, with her permission, to share it with the detective, which helped build that particular case. So 16, 4 more questions, and I think we can get through that. So 16, what did you think was going to happen? Look at their responses. Just to a person, I thought he was going to kill me. The one that still gives me chills is the woman who was telling me about saying her prayers and seeing her life flash in front of her. So if you go to 17, how did it stop? Really led us to witnesses. Somebody intervened, neighbor, child, police were at the door, which also shows their intent to kill. but for something intervening, or she passed out. Some of our victims say that he thought she was dead, and that's why they released the pressure, or they escaped and literally they're running out of the house, sometimes stark naked. If you go to number 18, what did you say when this was happening? And here you can sometimes find out about negotiation, pleading for their lives, really clearly explaining that they can't breathe, let me go. So there is a myth about if she can talk, she can scream, that she can breathe, and that's not true. This is much like the George Floyd incident where they were saying, and police, I think they've been mistrained when it comes to this. You are still losing oxygen to the brain, even though you are screaming. So you got to remember the brain and the airflow, the blood flow and the airflow. But slowly but surely, what you're doing is still depriving the body of oxygen, even though you can breathe. And in fact, Dr. Smock always says, you're not dead until you actually take your last breath. And so the heart may be working, and there's a whole myth about if she is screaming, they can breathe, and that's not necessarily true. There's a reduction and an impact, and ultimately death can occur. Okay, so 19, Casey likes this question a lot, is like, what is the last thing you remember? What's something you're never going to forget? And he has found that very useful. And I think number 20, as we're looking at learning more about how to prove cases without the victim's testimony, how to substantiate why a victim might recant or minimize or change her story, intimidation, going back to forfeiture by wrongdoing. Yes, you have the right to cross-examine your witnesses, but you can't have your cake and eat it too when there is a pattern of witness intimidation, keeping people from court, keeping them from following up with their hearings. So that's on the criminal side, and I know we've got a little bit of both, criminal and civil. So a couple of final tips, and then we are done. First, we're lucky in San Diego that we have extremely well-trained medical professionals, but that is not true across the United States. So I found this great little plain English that we got to train people first. And it's like what every nurse must recognize, that ER nurse. Maybe they're not forensically trained, but they're responding to these cases in the ER room. So that is also available on the World Wide Web and in our Dropbox. If you go to the next slide, I always say find a way to get a forensic exam, and our forensic nurses on our medical team are doing a fantastic job. Michelle and Diana came up with all of this, and it's now available online, and you can even buy it yourself off their website. Go to the next slide. Taking a lot of photographs. So even if you don't have the access to a forensic nurse, you can do a lot in your own office. And that's taking a full kind of head to toe photographs. And we usually did it in our office with an advocate, with the victim's permission. You can do quite a bit, just be clever and what's comfortable. Or if you could reach out to a forensic nurse to do that for you, better yet. But sometimes you just have to be resourceful. And of course, defendant exams are key. Go to the next one. I was just rereading this old article from 1981, and they had some really good statistics about injuries on the rapist, so stranger cases, and also the strangler. They called them throttlers back then. Interesting when you start reading older literature, what they use in terminology. But 65% of the time, victims were fighting for their lives, defending themselves, and the suspect had visible injuries to the hands, to the face, to the shoulders. And they also talked about biting, a lot of biting, just anything to try to get the pressure off and be able to breathe. Next slide. This is just an example of some of those injuries in this article. I'd read this article. I really loved it. Go to the next one. Look for other injuries. Victims are not just strangled. So we'll go through these photographs pretty quickly. You have a lot of hair pulling in these cases. They also pull their ears as they're trying to escape and get them right back or get a good grip. I've also seen cases where they're trying to leave marks where nobody can see, and strangulation is a weapon of choice because they know no visible injuries. This one, I used to call him the poker, but now I kind of think, did he strangle her to the point where he thought she was dead and trying to use CPR? And then, of course, as you're trying to figure this out, I wanted to share one of our mistakes and not to do it again. Do not reapply pressure to the victim's neck at all. This is a domestic violence response team in Northern California, and this is the victim advocate actually applying pressure to the victim. If you go to the next slide, you can actually see how traumatized she is. And this would be an excuse to say, well, who knows who caused all the symptoms, because you do have a photograph of the victim advocate applying pressure to the victim. But the challenge is in the next slide, if you don't have some method like Michelle shared, victims are naturally going to reapply pressure to themselves to answer the question how they were strangled. So you have to come up with another technique, and that wig head is a good one. I wanted to show you in the next slide what you're going to find, and we're almost wrapping things up. This is one of our detectives who I just love and adore. He did an amazing job after being trained, and on his own came up with a really important way to document strangulation. As you can see, he talks about small red spots, petechiae, around her forehead and that appear to be small broken capillaries. The condition has been described to me during training. It has been described as petechiae spots and are caused by tiny capillaries bursting from a pressure of a chokehold. She also complained of a sore throat and a hoarse voice. I encouraged her to seek medical attention. This was the first time he choked her. This was brilliant. And this was kind of, I don't know, not necessarily accidental, but I thought this is so good. We got to do it intentionally. Everybody, as we're writing up these cases, we have got to do a better job of writing this up and explaining strangulation to the court and to other professionals in our medical records, in restraining orders, and the list goes on. We had more time to go to all of the typical defenses, but I'm just going to highlight autoerotic asphyxia, which is generally done by yourself, but there is also erotic asphyxia, and you'll get the consent defense. She likes this. She wanted me to do this. She likes it rough. Well, in the case law, you cannot consent to something legally that can kill you, and strangulation is deadly force and poses substantial risk of death. With more time, this is probably just on defenses alone, a whole section in and of itself, but I wanted to highlight that, and we kind of talked about the others. Last but not least, just some victim advocacy points. The first one is do more. We recently came up with this kind of mnemonic about what can we do when we find a victim who's been strangled. And there's 5 important things. Document it well in your pleadings. We want to observe and ask about strangulation because they may not bring it to your attention. So always ask. M is really trying to get the medical documentation, medical treatment, medical assessment. O is for offer hope. That's information. Let them know about their rights. And also about healing and counseling and the science of hope. R is risk assessment, which Michelle shared with you, the 5 questions. I think all of us can ask at least 5 questions. E is for educate yourself, which you're doing now, and educate victims and others, which you're going to have to do as you start handling more of these cases. So we will help you in the next slide put together victim brochures. All you have to do, if you go to a couple of more slides, is to email us at the Training Institute with your logo, your contact information. We will help you get the brochure that you need to give your client this information so they can document their own signs and symptoms. Now, there's an app for that. In the next slide, I wanted to tell you about this new app that just came out where you can encourage your client, if she doesn't want to come to you or tell others, to keep documenting what is happening to them. Eventually, as we all know, they're going to need that information. Last but not least, I wanted to go over suicide ideation. And I'm going to go through it quickly because victims of human trafficking are experiencing the highest level of suicide ideation. If you are going through the stages of death, you have experienced a near death, near fatal situation, which is extremely traumatizing to you. You go from disbelief to resignation where you give up. In the next slide, the statistics, we don't have really good statistics in the United States, But what we do know is that many victims who sought help at our Family Justice Center said yes to suicide ideation, about 17%. In the Wilbur study, which is in the next slide, suicide ideation actually came up 31%. DV victims in general are going to be 12 times more likely to think about it and commit or die by suicide, according to the research. If you go to the next slide, here's the 31% suicide ideation. Look at the memory deficit, 31%. If you go to the next slide, this is out of that new article on human trafficking. 46% reported suicide ideation. 41.5% reported attempted suicide. So if I know that, I would be trying to get more information about this, get them to counselors, have some advocates as part of your team, and really address this issue. They're hopeless, and they need to have probably an introduction to the science of hope. And then a couple of other things for legally for you to help your clients. Not every hospital has adopted the imaging protocol, but you're going to have to fight for it. And I think strangulation, by everything that we have learned, is an emergency medical condition. There's a federal law that requires, especially like, public hospitals, to not turn away victims who have an emergency medical condition, and to give them the right treatment, assessment, and diagnosis, and all of that combined. The other thing is to think about victim compensation in the next slide, restitution. And if I was a little bit younger, this is something that we were going to start, Nick, until you left us, but you're doing great work at Free to Thrive. We were going to start a tort clinic to start suing people who were strangling and causing all of these long-term health consequences. Maybe when I retire, I'll just start a tort clinic then. But as we wrap up, I just want to give you a little bit of homework. Is be intentional, sprinkle some of the case law that's out there into your pleadings, help educate professionals about this, and not minimize strangulation as we've been doing for too many years. They deserve our advocacy. The next one is to go to the next slide, what I called your homework. We just did with the American Bar Association a 4-part series with 2 of my colleagues on this, and it's available for free. So if you want to learn more, we can give you access to more. The other one is I want you to read this article called Meet Me at the Hill Where We Used to Park. It goes through why victims recant. And I think it's our job to really help other professionals understand that it's not necessarily uncooperative. I say insert the word fearful. And there's a science behind witness intimidation, and there's even a recantation wheel. I love this article, and I think every professional needs to read it. And I think with that, we got just a couple of, there's the recantation wheel, and then a couple of resources. If you go to the next one, because I bet I'm out of time. Findings, a couple of quotes here, and they're finding at least 80% of the time victims of domestic violence, intimate partner violence are going to recant. There's a science that these researchers found out, and I love quoting this United States Supreme Court case, Davis versus Washington, that the particular crime, essentially of domestic violence, is notoriously susceptible of witness intimidation and coercion, especially trying to get victims from telling the truth, calling the police, or testifying in trial. Great quotes that you can add from our Supreme Court. Next is that human trafficking article that I would make available to you. I learned a lot just reading through it. Woo, I think I did it, Nick. Done.
Thank you so much, Gail. Yes, this we're right at the end of our time, and we have an opportunity to ask a few questions. There are a couple of questions that I saw, but just want to circle back on a couple things that Gail mentioned in her piece before we get to the questions. The first is that about 87% of Free to Thrive clients, all trafficking survivors, are reporting experiencing a domestic violence relationship, and nearly every single one of them reports strangulation. So that number is definitely higher than 54%. We also talked about the importance during this training of being trauma informed. Free to Thrive has some great trauma trainings on our website, led by managing attorney, president and founder of Free to Thrive, Jamie Beck, and Dr. Brittany Greenbaum. I encourage anyone who wants more information on how you can be more trauma informed when working with clients to check out those trainings. Also, just wanted to say, Gail, we did kind of start suing the abusers. There was that one, right, where we even sued the abuser's lawyer because they were aiding and abetting and continuing abuse. And that lawsuit actually survived an anti-SLAPP motion, which is a really incredible accomplishment. And it's still being litigated right now. And boy, is the shoe on the other foot for that abuser and then the lawyer that actually helped. Aided and abetted in that abuse. I have a couple of questions here. Laura asks, I've heard that victims state that they were bitten by particularly violent partners. Is this a step towards strangulation for you that you're seeing, Gail? Where does that fit in the spectrum?
Actually, I'm going to leave that one to Michelle because she sees so many victims and their injuries. What do you think, Michelle?
I don't know if I can say that it is an indicator with strangulation, but I can say that we see it a lot as part of it. And, patients will usually say, I just felt a stinging, like on my back. And when we look at them, they do have bite injuries. But, I don't think it'd be fair for me to give like a perception, but one of my nurses, Karen, who, again, we've done 700 exams of strangulation just since 2017. And she says that she's like, I see biting a lot more. So that's a great probably study that we need to put on our radar.
Good point.
Excellent. Vicky talks about being a domestic abuse manager in the UK and that strangulation is not recognized as significant there. No forensic services unless the victim has been raped. She wants to help change this. What are the top 3 things that she can do to help change this?
Well, I can hook you up with essentially some people in the UK that are trying to bring awareness and attention. So usually the first step, you need to have somebody who writes up a position paper to say, we need a strangulation law. And fortunately, there is such a paper in the UK. Also, Dr. Kath White is probably the only medical doctor doing forensic exams with strangulation in particular. She actually came to our 4-day course. So I think you need allies, but there is a slow movement, and internationally, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, and the UK are all trying to pass these laws. 2 really great papers have already been written from New Zealand, which is my personal favorite, Australia number 2, Canada has a paper and now they're starting to pass strangulation laws. And the UK was a law school professor who actually tried to make the business legal point that the UK needs a law as well. So all you need to do is email me and I can get you access to all these position papers. And then you get some friends. The more friends you bring together who sees and understands what you're trying to say, the better. I found it's very easy to kind of like almost dismiss one person because they might look like the lone nut, which is probably me many years ago. But when you have a whole team of folks, lawyers, nurses, doctors, that we all agree that this is important, people will listen.
And that, to that being said, like Gail said, is it took getting some champions, and the we had already had that. I see you already have some sexual assault team members, so you might want to check with your forensic nurses or your forensic examiners, because it is actually very very similar. So that might be a good resource, is to reach out to those that are already doing sexual assault exams and pitching it as it's an equal access to care. Because right now what I'm hearing is your strangulation and intimate partner violence patients are not getting an equal access to care as your sexual assault patients.
Well, thank you so much to our presenters. I know we have some more questions. Our presenters' email addresses and contact information is on the screen. This recording, this presentation is being recorded. And I just want you all to know that San Diego has so many resources in this area, but primarily Gail and Michelle are just going to be wonderful resources for you to get more information about how you can work up a case involving strangulation, how you can prepare your expert and just a number of resources. We're going to send out a link to this presentation as well as the materials just after the presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we're just really excited to be able to share this with you. There was one question we didn't get to that I wanted to make sure that we got to. Afra asked a question about what really is a missed opportunity in the medical community to intervene in what might have been a strangulation case, or what sounds like it sure was. One of the best things you can do is take the information that you have here and be an ambassador for people that you know and that you care about and other people in your community, to let them know how serious this really is, and that this is something that needs a closer look if it's something that somebody has experienced. Thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate your attention, and we hope you found this valuable.
Thank you, Nick, for the invite.
And
bye, Michelle.
thank you, Gail. Thank
Bye,
you, Michelle.
Jamie.
Hi,
Elaine,
thank you, everybody. Thank you,
and
Gail. Thank you,
Fernanda.
Nick.